Afternoon and good evening. We have people from around the world. We have students at IACA, at International Anti-Corruption Academy, right from Mexico to Australia. All are registered, they are here. And I'm sure people around the world are looking at and watching this webinar. This topic, whistleblowing and whistleblower protection in COVID era, is extremely relevant. And that is why we have chosen. Especially, we have been hearing news about different criminal activities happening all around the world. There are a lot of emergency responses which entails discretionary decisions, and emergency responses also involve giving funds to the people to survive. So at this moment, the corruption is one of the very vulnerable issue, and we have chosen this topic so that we can discuss it and also see how we can use this particular tool as a prevention and detection of corruption. So we have with us our Dean of International Anti-Corruption Academy, Mr. Thomas Stelzer. We have Ms. Anna Myers as our moderator. And we have panelists Leah Ambler, Karin Buzanik-Somerega, Mr. Andrea Alfonso, Franzoso, and Fabian Tickman. Let me introduce to our Dean first. He is member of the Foreign Service of Republic of Austria and has served as permanent representative of Austria to various United Nations offices in Vienna and New York. And more recently, he was ambassador to Portugal before joining IACA as Dean. He also served as Assistant Secretary General of Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at United Nations, and as Secretary of United Nations Chief Executive Boards. At the Austrian Permanent Mission in New York, he had worked in the areas of international security and disarmament issues, as well as development cooperation and comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. Before joining Foreign Service, he worked as freelance journalist and political science researcher in Latin America. He holds a JD degree and his alumni of Vienna University, Stanford University, and Johns Hopkins University in US. Anna Myers, she is our moderator. She is founding executive director of the Whistleblowing International Network, WIN, a network to strengthen civil society organizations that defend and support whistleblowers around the world. Anna has worked in the field of whistleblowing, law, and practice for 20 years. A qualified lawyer from Canada, she was deputy director of public concern at work, now called Protect, in London, and worked for groups of states against corruption, which we call GRECO, in Strasbourg. She advised the Council of Europe's Committee on Legal Cooperation in 2014 and drafted the UNODC resource guide on good practices in protection of reporting persons. Under her leadership, WIN played an important role in advocating for an EU directive to protect whistleblowers and help secure essential provisions in law that was adopted. Leah Ambler, she is from OECD, a legal analyst at the Anti-Corruption Division of OECD, where she also manages Asia Pacific Anti-Corruption Initiative. In her role at the OECD, she supports the working group of briberies monitoring of OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and related instruments. Leah was co-chair of International Bar Association Anti-Corruption Committee, that is 2017 and 19. Earlier, she worked for Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and for international law firm in Tokyo. Leah has combined law and Asian studies degree from Australian National University and is admitted as both barrister and solicitor. Karin Buzanik-Somerega, a partner based in a firm in Vienna office, where she heads the People and Rewards team Karin specializes in employment issues in multi-country corporate transactions and cross-border matters, and employer-side employment law and occupational pension matters. Andrea Franzoso lives in Milan. He holds a bachelor degree in philosophy, a master's science in law, and an MBA degree. Andrea served 10 years as officer in the Arma dei Carabinieri, where he reached the rank of captain. Then he worked for F&M Group in internal audit unit and as CSR manager. Andrea is a whistleblower and for a very noble cause, and we will hear him during this webinar. Fabian Tickman is attorney at law and managing partner of Tickman International, a mid-sized Swiss law firm. After having graduated with master's degree in management and from Harvard University, he earned PhD in both law and economics in Switzerland and Germany, respectively. Fabian also holds an LLM as well as several finance degrees from Switzerland and Italy. He specializes in prevention of white-collar crime. This is introduction of the panel, and I welcome all the panelists for this webinar. And before I hand over to our Dean for inaugural address, it is a general announcement that this webinar will be recorded, and the recorded version will be available on IACA's website, that is www.iaca.int. And there is another announcement that we will have question answer session after the webinar. Keep sending your questions through chat function, and we will try to take as many questions as possible. In case we are not able to do it, please send your questions to the email address which was provided at the time of registration, and which is studies@iaca.int, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Thank you so much, and I will welcome Dean Stelzer for his inaugural address.
Thank you very much for the introduction. We're all very happy that our webinar is meeting such global interest. We believe that this is very timely to give you the opportunity to learn about whistleblowing in this time of profound crisis, the most profound crisis most of us have ever lived through, starting as a pandemic and then turning to an economic crisis and now turning into a social crisis, which has seen unprecedented funds infused into economies, very often without adequate control mechanisms, and in many instances benefiting unscrupulous people who are taking advantage of the vulnerabilities and counterfeiting of medical supplies, extortion of services, which is otherwise due to people, corruption in emergency procurements, misuse of special funds, mushrooming of sinister NGOs have all been reported by the news. Of course, in a situation like this, good governance is crucial. And good governance also gives security to come up and make transparent what is happening. We are dealing today with whistleblowers, showing that that timely exposure of any wrongdoings will benefit societies, states, the people, the global community at large. And we believe, and that will be worked upon in this webinar, that whistleblowing in these times is crucial. So we're very happy that we've been able to bring together such eminent panelists who will share with you their experiences and then, of course, try to, in a communication which has become possible even online and in this virtual space, respond to your individual questions. Let me just say two things about the International Anti-Corruption Academy that most of you have not yet been in contact with. We are a pretty small organization outside of Vienna, but the only international organization exclusively dealing with the fight against corruption. Our most recognized programs are academic. We have been offering 2 master's programs. In the past, in a conservative way, face-to-face, but now in this time of social distancing and isolation, we have turned our challenges into opportunities, and we have translated pretty much all of our expertise and contents into an e-learning platform. So our ongoing master's programs are being offered already through e-learning basis. We didn't lose any time, and all our students can participate without loss in quality and without any time lag. For the next academic year, we have been working on an exclusively online master's class already, which we will evaluate, taking into account the experiences we are gaining from this year's forced situation, to see how, by using these new platforms, we can increase our diffusion capacity and not only teach, a significant number. We have about 3,000 alumni in 161 countries, but we want to take our content into a far wider audience. And my dream as Dean is that in the future, every future diplomat, any future manager of the international system, every future manager of the global economy will have some anti-corruption training. So this is why our modules will have to be introduced in academic curricula, and we'll try to make them available on this newly gained expertise and technical basis to as many people as possible. So I'll stop here. I don't want to steal your time. Hand over to the panelists, and looking forward to a very interesting webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Again, I think without losing time, I will hand over to Anna, who is our moderator, and floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you very much, Pau, and thank you very much, Mr. Stelzer. It's very nice to meet you online. I am very grateful for having had a longer relationship with IACA and have had taught within some of the master's programs, which I enjoyed very much, because one of the things that is so important around the issue of whistleblowing is the continuing discussion of what it means in different cultures and in different legal jurisdictions around the world, and how we can empower people to speak up. I'm really delighted to have to be able to have this conversation as well with Andrea, who's gone through the experience of raising concerns, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the issue further with our panel. I was wondering at the moment if the panelists wouldn't mind if they have their videos open to maybe turn them off so that Andrea and I can have a chat. And as someone who's worked in the field for a long time, but also very much remains a student of whistleblowing myself, all of these conversations are ones that I learn a great deal from. And I wanted to acknowledge this panel is obviously very much European focused in many ways. And I think if one of the things we've learned in working with the organizations that support whistleblowers around the world, we have 14 member organizations that are ones that give direct legal advice to whistleblowers, and over 40 associate organizations, NGOs around the world working to support whistleblowers and to protect them in law and in practice. And when we say practice, that's institutional, cultural, education. There's a whole panoply of tools that go into, mechanisms that go into supporting whistleblowers. But one of the things that we really found out early on when the pandemic happened was that people were immediately raising issues directly in the public domain, certainly around issues around health, protective equipment, food supplies, and we'll probably see more of that. It's very important that we see and hear things as the public, but we also are very aware that organizations also need to know what's happening, things that they might not be as aware of themselves. Certainly if their risk management systems are, have been changed dramatically, having themselves gone into remote working. So there's plenty of issues that are coming up in terms of whistleblowing and corruption. But I would first like to start, perhaps Andrea will come back and you might want to just say hello briefly, but we have a short YouTube video that we'd like to play. So Andrea, do you want to just say hello, and then we'll watch your case, and then we'll come back and have a quick discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. So we can start with the video, or okay?
Yeah,
thank you.
And then we'll come back to you. Okay.
Okay.
E noi siamo sempre qui ad aspettare. Non se ne può più.
60 euro al mese per un servizio inesistente.
Cosa se ne fa uno delle scuse? Niente, non viaggia con le scuse, viaggia coi treni.
Attorno a me si è fatto il vuoto, i miei colleghi sono spariti, mi sono stati tolti i miei incarichi e sono stati affidati ad un consulente esterno e infine sono stato trasferito ad un finto incarico.
Qui non esiste i ladri, gli onesti. Bene che vada, esiste una serie di conniventi.
Hanno giocato un ruolo importante anche l'indignazione, il disgusto che io ho provato verso la strafottenza, l'avidità, forse meglio dire la voracità di questi personaggi, nominati dalla politica per gestire un'azienda pubblica e se ne sono serviti per arricchirsi o per accrescere il loro potere.
Wonderful. Andrea, I found that a really powerful piece of video. I know it was created by Reparti il Futuro, now called the Good Lobby Italy. They're one of our associate members as well, but I'm always so impressed with the work that these organizations do. It paints a particular picture, obviously, of the ramifications that can occur personally when one does speak up, especially when others are not speaking up. And I think that's one of the points that comes through is that the whistleblower is not always the only person who knows what's going on. It's the person that actually takes on the risk that others may be too frightened within the same organization to take on, or believe that that's the way it always should be. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, I mean, if you wanted to comment on anything about the video and about your particular position now, because one of the things I think that even as organizations that might use the law to protect whistleblowers, what are the things that help people? It's a very stressful situation to be put in, and what did you find most helpful to you in sort of getting through this?
Okay, thank you. What helped me was the fact that career is not the most important thing in my life. So I have other values. I have friends. I love mountains. I love books, theater, and so on. So my job is not my only source of identity. So my sources of identity are outside of my company. So my job was important, of course, but it was not enough. If I would betray my values, I would kill myself. So when I had to choose between my career and my values, I decided to save myself, to save what I am. And I didn't need to reflect a long time to take that decision. It was immediate. When I discovered what my president used to do, immediately I reported it inside the company. And when I knew that the company didn't want to persecute, to go on, to discover, I went to the police, where I signed a report with my name and my surname. I didn't want to be an anonymous whistleblower.
That's an interesting point. And I also think there's two questions I just want to ask you just coming out of what you just said. One of the things that we know we've struggled to get defined in law is this issue of, well, it's already your job. You were already an auditor. So how can you be a whistleblower when you were just doing your job? You know, and I think that that's one of the things that comes out from your case is that most whistleblowers are doing what we're hired to do. And at what point did you say, or did you even start to perceive that there was going to be a problem or that you were in a whistleblowing position? I mean, when did you start to call yourself that? And you mentioned to me earlier, there's not necessarily a good word for it in Italian.
At a certain point, I noticed that my story was used by other people. Other people found the courage to blow the whistle after my story. I personally went to the police with some other whistleblowers, for example, and the video you watched was realized by an Italian organization against corruption, because I was, in a certain sense, a testimonial of to support the approval of a law in favor to protect whistleblowers. I didn't imagine all this visibility on my story, because when I decided to blow the whistle, I only did what I felt it was a duty to me, no more. And I knew I could suffer negative consequences. Probably I would have lost my job. Yes, I considered it, but I'm very optimistic, and I said that I could reinvent myself to find maybe to get another job, to do something else. It was too much important to be connected to my true me.
And that isn't always the case, obviously, for other individuals who speak up. They don't always feel like they have a future after the whistleblowing, or it's a tough one. And you said that you've met quite a few people for whom that's the case.
Probably they don't trust enough on themselves. Yeah. Everyone is different. Of course, it's difficult to give tips to other people. But probably I felt I had the resources to restart somewhere else. And another thing I think it was important to me, it is important to me, is the fact that my self-esteem is not on my success in the career, on to show a position. For example, when I lost my job, I was ready to start from a lower position. I said, if I'm not able to find another job as manager, okay, I can sell ice cream or I can go and work in a bookshop. What's the problem? I can start again, then to change. But I have the responsibility to save what my values, what I am, and I think our happiness. Everyone wants to be happy, and I felt that my happiness. I could find my happiness this way. So reporting the wrongdoing, reporting what disgusted myself.
No, that's it. I think one of the things that the reason I ask some of these questions is even as a lawyer and knowing how important the law is to protect whistleblowers. You know, there isn't a one size fits all, and many people do come through it. Obviously, we hear about the ones that where obviously you did suffer at work and you did have to go to court. We still hear about the cost. It's not necessarily always risk fee, but there are elements about you and how you view the future, and for others who get support and see a future beyond whistleblowing. That's very important for lawyers to even think about what the law could do to help people see a future.
Yeah, of course, it's important to have a law to protect whistleblowers, to help whistleblowers to get another job, for example, not only to save our job position, but to help us to find something else, because it's not sure that whistleblowers want to stay in the same place, because you know, the colleagues, other managers, the relationship among you and others is damaged. So maybe it's better to go away. There are many costs to support. For example, the first time when I went I met my lawyer, I spent 200 euro. And then when I decided to start a trial against my company, I spent 3,000 euro. Okay, and when a person has a family, when a person doesn't earn a lot of money, it's hard to pay 3,000 euro or even more, because at the end, the cost of my lawyer was 13,000 euro. When I left my company, a part of this cost was supported paid by my company, but it's a cost. So I think a law support to protect whistleblowers has to consider this aspect, because I'm not in favor do a word in favor of whistleblowers, but a compensation is necessary.
You participated in the video. You worked with Reparti il Futuro. I know you also have contacts with Transparency Italy. I think you're doing close contacts with them, and you're doing a webinar, I think, tomorrow. The video is made in anticipation of Italy passing a whistleblower law. I was wondering if you could make a comment both on the current Italian law, and if you know about the EU directive, you know, do you think that that's going to change it? So the first is really the comment on the Italian law. What do you think? Yeah, just what do you think of it, and how well it works?
Yeah, the Italian law is good to protect people working, employees in the public sector. It's okay, but our law is not enough to protect employees in the private sector. So at the moment, there is no protection, not for workers in the private sector. So for sure, thanks to the European directive, we will improve our law. But I think it would be necessary to organize also a house of whistleblowers, like in the Netherlands. because many people don't know, need to have support. Many whistleblowers, many people who want to denounce, to report wrongdoing, write to me, for example, through Facebook, to Messenger, etc., Instagram, and asking for help. But it's not my job. So very often I say, okay, you can write to Transparency International. There is a service organized by Transparency International. Write to them. But I know that people don't want to be alone. They want to feel that they are connected to other experts, lawyers, I don't know, and someone needs also for a psychologist, because of course when you lose your job, you can live a depression, you suffer. I stayed, for example, for more than 1 year unemployed, and I assure that it's very difficult.
I think one of the things that we did an earlier webinar, and I know that there's a lot going on with people talking about this issue. And one of the things that I always want to point out is that we need more lawyers offering pro bono services, but also to understand it from a public interest point of view. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I think whistleblowers find, or individuals who find themselves in a whistleblowing dilemma and a whistleblowing position, need advice that helps them continue to raise the issue. You talked a lot about it mattered to you. It wasn't just your position that you were worried about. The reason you spoke up was because you felt it was wrong and needed to be addressed. There was corruption and fraud in your company. If they had just said you're protected, but the fraud or the corruption wasn't addressed, I don't think, from what you've told me, that you would have felt satisfied by that. And I think it's very interesting to think about lawyers who will help the public interest information with you as much as trying to protect your position during that process. And I'm not sure we have enough lawyers, although we've got great ones on our panel, who think about it in those terms. How much legal support is there in Italy?
I think we have not enough legal support. Transparency, for example, has organized a team supporting whistleblowers, but we need many lawyers, because really it is very expensive to face it, to be in a trial, because you risk also a trial, because sometimes the whistleblowers are accused of defamation.
Yes.
One manager in my company accused me for defamation. I won the trial, but I spent €7,000. Then, of course, the judge, the courts of Milan, imposed to restore my expenses, but I didn't receive back the entire amount of my expenses, because I spent 7,000 and I received 3,800. So why have I to lose my money only because I said the truth? Because many times some managers or other politicians or who have the possibilities to spend money much more than employees, and so we need the compensation. We need the foreign help. Someone proposes a word to give money to whistleblowers. It depends, because in our culture in Italy, I think it is not a good solution, because during fascism, people was paid to denounce, to report Jewish, etc. So it's we have a memory very negative about people who receive money to report someone else, even if whistleblower reports wrongdoing. But you know, it's not easy.
It's very interesting. I think we are wanting to pick that up as an issue because it is one that gets talked a lot about, this difference between offering a reward, what is considered some sort of financial incentive for whistleblowing, whether that's also empowering whistleblowers, and whether, and I've heard so many different views taking very different but very logical positions, I think, on what that would mean. But what you're very clear on from your perspective is the compensation that has to come has to be much more holistic in terms of it can be payments, obviously, for all the monetary outlay that you had to do for your trials and for going through the judicial system, and to be fully compensated for that. But also you were talking about, you know, jobs and being able to perhaps even move on, that trust and confidence that's often only talked about from the employer's point of view, that they lose trust in staff. And that's often the core issue that gets discussed in tribunals or in courtrooms, but also the individual who's faced that may have lost trust and confidence in that organization. You suggested something earlier to me around how that might work. There is a law in Italy already, and you suggested it could be reworked. Do you want to just explain that briefly to the audience?
The law about it?
You mentioned there was a law in Italy that helped people find jobs. Do you want to explain what
no, yes,
your
I
idea?
told you. No, I said, okay, in Italy, there is a law to protect some groups of people to get a job. For example, victim of terrorism, or you know, people with an handicap, etc. So I proposed to help a whistleblower in this way. So saying that you know, there are many companies saying that we are in favor of whistleblowing. We have a beautiful sustainability report. We are for transparency. Okay, demonstrate it. So are you in favor of whistleblowing? Hire the whistleblower. So we could help a whistleblower. So at a certain point, when an organization, you can imagine the house of whistleblowers, we can ask the whistleblower, what do you want? How can I help you? Do you want to stay there, the same position, or do you want to change? We can help you to change. So I imagine a law like this, but in general, we have to change our mind, our culture. That's why I go very often to schools. In Italy, many students, even very young, because I go very often even to the primary school, Italian students and children know what whistleblowing is, even if in Italian we do not have a word to translate whistleblower. On the contrary, in Italy, we have the terrible word omertà. Omertà means a person who don't see, don't listen, don't speak. So it's very negative. That's why we have hard work to do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I mean, I think you covered so much in a very short time, including this idea of both the importance of the law, but the attitudes, the education, talking to young people. These are all very familiar to me, but I'm always amazed at how creatively it's done and at who picks it up when and why. So to hear in Italy how much work you've been doing going around to schools from the youngest level up to university level for very different discussions around your story, and the fact that it's been picked up in university courses as well is just fantastic because it keeps the conversation going. What I'd like to do now is ask all the panelists to turn their videos back on. You can, welcome to stay, Andrea, and there'll be some questions coming through. I think that there's going to be a lot of very specific questions. We'll try and get to some of them, but I would like to start with Lee. I think even in talking to Andrea, you start to see how, you know, Italians need to talk to Italians about this, and how there's issues around a law that came into place. So it was a very good first step in Italy, but it only covered the public sector. We've had questions come through already on the EU directive. So yes, there's an EU directive, and I'll just answer the question. It was adopted on the 16th of December of 2019. It has exactly till the 17th of December 2021 to be adopted by all the 27. Unfortunately, I'm in one that's now no longer the final 28, to be transposed into national law. And I know that the OECD has done a lot of work over the years. There's issues around what is in the EU directive, and it's a very good solid base, but there's also international best practices, and your organization has been part of the discussion in revealing what some of those are and doing some of that research. So if you want to unmute, I would really like to ask you a little bit to just sort of describe the global legal infrastructure as far as you see, particularly with respect to OECD countries.
Thanks very much, Anna, and I'd like to thank the International Anti-Corruption Academy for the opportunity to join this webinar. Also, a huge thanks to Andrea for sharing your experience and your courage in what you went through in Italy. Before I delve into what for me personally and professionally is such an important issue, and one where there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done, I just wanted to say that the views that I will be presenting are my own. They don't represent the member countries of the OECD or the states parties to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. And I think, I mean, what we've heard already from Andrea and what I've been seeing through some of the comments is this, a lot of questions about the legal framework. And for me as a lawyer, the first step to providing comprehensive protection for reporting persons is a harmonized legal framework. And as an international lawyer, that means strong, harmonized international standards. And as you said, Anna, I mean, for me, the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive is revolutionary. Up until the adoption of that directive, there was very little in terms of international standards, and those standards that did exist or that do currently exist, particularly in the anti-corruption sphere, are very weak. There was a question earlier about the UNCAC and what standards are there in the UN Convention Against Corruption to protect whistleblowers. In Article 33 of the Convention, there is a reference to protecting whistleblowers. It's an optional article of the convention. It's not mandatory for states parties, and it has this requirement that whistleblowers report in good faith, which is the same as the current OECD standards for whistleblower protection contained in the 2009 anti-bribery recommendation, and a standard that proves quite difficult to implement in practice, how to measure whether or not a person is reporting in good faith and whose word to believe. You know, we see this EU whistleblowing directive as a step forward in setting out not only standards for defining who can report and who is considered a whistleblower, also the subject matter of their report. A lot of the international standards protect only those who report criminal offences, or even narrower still, corruption offences. And I know that this discussion is taking place in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of the reporting there doesn't necessarily concern crimes as such, but more threats to the public health and safety. And so it's important to have broad protections for a wide range of subject matter. In terms of the international legal framework, I'd say that it's still in its infancy. There are several countries that have long established whistleblower protection legislations in place, such as the United States, which has a plethora of different laws to protect different reporting in different contexts, different sectors. Some that provide rewards that were discussed earlier for whistleblowers, or indeed compensation or interim relief for some of the costs that may be incurred by whistleblowers during various proceedings that they may have to undergo. The UK also has a very well established public interest Disclosures Act, as well as Ireland. Korea also has some very strong whistleblower protection legislation and a specific agency that's mandated to enforce that legislation, which is something that came up earlier. But as a lawyer, I think one of the challenges working in this area is that it covers so many different types of law. So you not only have to be familiar with employment law, because often whistleblower protection provisions are sort of housed in labour laws and relate to unfair dismissal or harassment provisions. As we know, whistleblowers can be subject to other forms of retaliation like defamation suits, as Andrea was unfortunately subject to. They can also be criminally prosecuted for violating various secrecy laws, so you need to be a criminal lawyer as well. Now, particularly in the EU, you need to have some expertise in data protection and privacy law because there are intersections between the General Data Protection Regulation and the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. In some cases, companies may find themselves in a situation where following data protection legislation, they have to inform the subject of a whistleblower complaint of the existence of that complaint against that subject. So there's a lot of contradictions as well when it comes to navigating whistleblower protection law. There's also civil law implications, such as issues of suits for damages or defamation suits, as I mentioned earlier. There's corporations law aspects as well, where increasingly countries are legislating to require corporations of various forms to implement protected reporting frameworks and how those are enforced. And Australia has a very interesting, very recent example of that legislation, which the Australian Securities and Investments Commission is responsible for enforcing and supervising how publicly listed companies are implementing these reporting mechanisms. And then there's an administrative law perspective as well, looking at which agencies within government have oversight and enforce these laws. And Andrea mentioned the Dutch House of the Whistleblowers is a very interesting and as far as I know, world only example of a dedicated whistleblower protection authority. Other countries have mandated their ombudsman to protect whistleblowers and advise whistleblowers, and other countries have mandated their anti-corruption agencies to receive whistleblower reports and provide protection. And I mentioned Korea's Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission earlier as a very interesting example, which also provides psychological advice and legal advice for whistleblowers, or outsources that to various associations in Korea. So that's in a nutshell some perspectives on the challenge in addressing whistleblower protection under an international and national legal frameworks. But I think that there is so much momentum right now, and I hope that that leads to really positive change. And then, you know, there's obviously cultural aspects as well that need to be addressed, and how to make sure that those laws are implemented.
Thank you very much, Lee. That is a world tour for sure. I was just going to mention one of the ones that was just the Maison des Lanceurs d'Alerte. So we have, you mentioned the Dutch Dutch House of Whistleblowers, which is governmented. And then there's the Maison des Lanceurs d'Alerte in France, which is a civil society effort. And it's so interesting to see, you know, how independent do organizations need to be trusted by the general population in terms of going there, but actually how do they stay funded and resourced if they try to be sort of completely out with government. And I know the OECD has looked at these, so the anti-corruption agencies, some have had checkered past, some can be incredibly powerful, and then have go through less powerful periods or being less effective on the whistleblowing side. Could I just ask you the small follow-up about the OECD? And I know that they've spent a bit of time on this issue, and you've done a lot of work. And is this something that still remains high on the OECD agenda? And is it something that's come back up because of the pandemic?
I'd say that absolutely the issue of whistleblower protection remains high on the agenda at the OECD in general. The Working Group on Bribery is currently reviewing its 2009 recommendation on further combating foreign bribery. And that is scheduled for finalisation next year. And the members of the OECD Working Group on Bribery have prioritised whistleblower protection among the issues to be addressed in that review. So you will see new strengthened standards on whistleblower protection in that recommendation. In the public integrity sphere as well, there's work being done to assist governments to build up a culture of encouraging reporting and protecting those who report from a public sector perspective. And then in terms of the OECD's participation in the G20, last year, with the support of the OECD, the G20 adopted its high-level principles on whistleblower protection, which we see as, you know, a huge achievement in terms of getting this issue on the global agenda, given the specific membership of the G20. So that was under the Japanese presidency of the G20 that those high-level principles were adopted. So indeed, the issue remains very high on the agenda. In terms of how it's being considered in the context of the pandemic, I think it's too early to say that that has led to any specific policy changes as such, but we are collecting information at the moment on any specific measures that, that governments are taking to promote and protect whistleblowing during the crisis, and specifically in relation to fraud and corruption related to healthcare procurement. And there'll be a policy note coming out in the next couple of weeks, so I'd be happy to circulate that and make that available to you. But there's some very interesting examples of countries that have dedicated hotlines for whistleblowers on COVID-19 related corruption and fraud and we're seeing cases coming out as well where investigations and prosecutions have been started already in relation to bribery in the context of that procurement.
Great. That's all really important news, I think, for people to know that there's more coming. We've had some interesting questions, which I think we're grappling with. So they're great questions. I'm not sure we can immediately answer. How, you know, in the potential and certainly current job loss situation, job protection when you blow the whistle is a really difficult one. And again, it's not like there's never been issues of quite big job losses in certain industries, never across the board the way we've had. But we are looking, I think, as people working in this field, to really think through some of these very difficult issues because people will be losing their jobs for all sorts of reasons, and that can be the cover for getting rid of those who you think are going to be raising things that you don't want necessarily to be out there. Now, that's assuming that all organizations don't like whistleblowers. I thought we would talk to Karen, who's worked, I think, a lot in the area of risk management and corporate responsibility. And, you know, talking out from the point of view of also talking to employers about what are the barriers and how they can address these as in terms of risk management. I'd really be interested in your views, Karen.
Sure. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much to Jakob for the opportunity to join this discussion. So as Pawan said, I'm a partner at Freshfields, a global law firm. So my experience with whistleblowing relates to two main areas. One is the implementation of speak-up policies or whistleblowing policies for global employers. And the second is advising employers essentially on the treatment of whistleblowers. And I very often work with ethics officers or people like this. So that's really interesting. And it's just to say that there are some huge organizations who do have something like an ethics office, so working on the right angle of that whole area. And so from what I've seen on the cases I've advised on, the barriers are twofold. And I'm talking as a lawyer already. One area is the core legal issues, and then we've got the factual issues that are closely related to the legal points. On legal, as has been mentioned already, the EU directive is such a huge step to the right direction. And it was such an important sign by the European Union to say this is an important topic and member states need to do something about it. I think there's also been a question on whether there is a direct obligation for organizations or employers to implement whistleblowing or speak up policies or to enable whistleblowing. And just to say on the directive, so the directive is aimed at the member states, not directly at companies. So that would be a second step. But however, it's such an important step. However, implementation and transposition is a bit tricky, and I've been involved in discussions where the legal assessment has shown that actually national laws don't need to be adapted that much to actually implement the directive. The basic legal framework is existent in many countries, and I'm speaking mainly about Europe here, but there's hardly any country where it would be legal to retaliate or to fire an employee who spoke up, to put it very, very expressly. So the issue is more about technical, sometimes a little boring legal issues. And on internal reporting, this is around some countries or jurisdictions have a requirement to obtain individual consent to implement the speak up policy. So this is very tricky. What do you do if you receive consent from half your workforce but not the other half? Some jurisdictions will have a requirement to involve employee representatives, not something management is very keen to do. And then there's this big question mark about anonymous reporting. Obviously, it's very important for most whistleblowers to stay anonymous, but then if you have a follow-up question, what do you do? How do you deal with this? That's the main areas we see around the internal speak up policies and the legal problems, or the small legal things that need tweaks to enable proper transposition of the directive into national laws. And then on external reporting outside the employer organization, you of course have the reputational worries. So organizations or employers are very often very worried about their reputational risk if they encourage external reporting. But then there's also another part to this. In some jurisdictions, you have speak-up policies that are set up by authorities. So for example, Financial Market Authority in a country could have a whistleblowing or reporting hotline. But then sometimes the statutes of these hotlines, they say, please report internally first, because they don't feel they can deal or want to deal with all that an organization brings out. So sometimes there's a misconception of statutes like that. And then of course, as Andrea said, worries at the side of the whistleblower to ever find a new job in that area once he has blown the whistle. So what do we do about these issues? From what I've seen in my work is the legal issues, the issues around legal transposition and implementation of whistleblowing systems. Much can be done if you work with the design of the whistleblowing hotline. So if you think about that, and if you amend little things sometimes around how voluntary it is to use the speak up system, around who gets access, who do you really need to see the reports, and then third, saving and processing the reports. It is, especially in Europe again, the new data protection laws are very strict. So sometimes you'll have legal assessment or legal review. Can I implement this global policy in my country? And then the first reaction of lawyers will be no, not possible due to data protection. But then it's usually, from what I've seen, worth going back to the details. And then sometimes you can just tweak a little around the details of the policy, and then it is legally permissible. So that was the core legal points that I wanted to address. But then there's this other huge area, and I think they are very closely linked to the legal points, but that's factual points. And these are around organizational on the one hand, and what I call social retaliation on the other hand. So the organizational ones are again a bit blunt, but they are in fact easy access. How do I manage to provide easy access to persons who want to speak up? That is difficult in practice. Then it's involve the relevant stakeholders as early as possible. Again, something that goes wrong very often in practice. And then the third is again the form and the follow-up, proper follow-up on reports, because often you get very interesting and worth to follow up reports, but then there is a risk that they get lost somewhere in big organizations. So that's my third point in this. On the social retaliation points, that is so important what Andrea said about his case. And I think we need to bear in mind that I think Italy, very similar to the German-speaking areas within Europe, and I'd dare to say most of continental Europe maybe, is very different culture-wise from the Anglo-American areas, for example. Because in continental Europe, or in many jurisdictions I've worked with, and certainly in the German-speaking area, the concept of whistleblowing is not seen as something genuinely good. It's very unfamiliar in a way. And so there is a culture issue around whistleblowing that I see very, very explicitly in all the cases I've worked on. And as Andrea said, you feel you have to decide between your own values and your career. And I think many employees that I've spoken to even thought, even if my career may be safeguarded because that's an employer who will comply with all the laws, but they felt they need to decide between their values and their friends at work or their good standing in the company. And that's also something that should not be the case. So from my perspective, to change all this and to enable whistleblowing and a healthy speak-up culture, to me, that needs a lot of boardroom work. In fact, I think it needs convincing people who have to say something and to have the weight to move something in big organizations, to move corporate culture or steer corporate culture to where we can have legal departments to feel enabled to work on the legal tweaks that I mentioned, but then also to minimize this strange feeling that whistleblowing is something not really good, or at least unfamiliar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think you covered it from that point of view, even as a lawyer working with organizations and sort of going, I know what's right and I know how the law works, but at the same time, the two need to marry too. They can become slightly divorced, and you know that there can be legal readings that are so narrow, they start to divorce from the reality of the situation. And that's really important for boardroom culture to understand, and the board to be really addressed themselves. One of the things that when Lee was going through the laws, where there has been some good laws in different countries, one of the ones is in Serbia. And one of the tricks in the Serbian law, which is actually a Serbian element, it's the only law where there is actually a duty for every judge to be certified first before they can hear a whistleblowing case. So actually to go through training. And it's the going through the training which has happened across Serbia, where judges themselves think about their own ethical dilemmas, start to put themselves in that position. And it has changed the culture of the courts in hearing whistleblowing cases. And because some of the judges went through that training, some of them, and interim relief is one of the things that comes up in the legal context to kind of hold people in the position to try and get that quickly, have a court say that, and in different countries that is more accessible than in others. But in Serbia, for instance, it wasn't necessary. In many countries, the legal system and the legal process is so long and takes so long that people's right, they're suffering more harm just waiting for the judicial system to determine whether they should be suffering any harm. But that in fact, the judges that were trained were turning around some of the interim relief applications even through the Christmas and New Year period where they would normally not be available. So you can see that actually people really understanding what this means that they may start to give the benefit of the doubt to whistleblowers, instead of starting with the doubt, which is what you're both talking about. There's a doubt that everyone is starting with. And if you switch that, you start to look at it a little bit more neutrally, even though you feel like you're sort of changing something that's neutral. It's not neutral to be always doubtful of every staff member. It doesn't mean that you lose your critical capacity. So I think there's very interesting things that are there that we can all draw from in terms of changing people's minds. And unfortunately, it's systems and people that run them. Can I move now to Fabian? Is it Fabian or Fabian? You can tell me if you can unmute. And you were going to talk to us a little bit about the case of the doctor in China. And I was going to ask you, obviously that was one of the first things that really hit and carried some weight outside of, outside of China, but through Europe and through North America. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that case and whether you think, you know, that's just China and not anywhere else. We've certainly heard other cases of the healthcare professionals around the world speaking up and some of them being silenced and fired. So if you could start talking about that, that would be great, Fabian.
Thank you, Anna. So Li Wenliang was an eye doctor in Wuhan, China, and the first person to call attention to COVID-19. He practiced at a local hospital, was a 34-year-old guy, married, father of a child, just expecting a second one. So certainly someone who had something to lose. Nevertheless, he found the courage to blow the whistle on COVID-19. At the end of December 2019, he sent out a message to 7 former classmates in a group chat on the Chinese messaging app WeChat, told his colleagues that in the hospital he worked at 7 cases of SARS had been confirmed. And today we know that his patients had been affected with COVID-19. In the group chat, Wenliang asked his colleagues to be careful and to protect themselves from the disease. Ultimately, a screenshot of the conversation found its way to the internet. Soon the hashtag WuhanSARS began trending on the Chinese social media platform Weibo, and the government began to censor any information regarding the outbreak. On the same day, the local health authority published an internal handout discussing a pulmonary disease of unknown origin that was spreading throughout Wuhan and to be handled with confidentiality. During this time, important political meetings were pending, and all members of the group chat were summoned by the police and reprimanded for allegedly spreading rumors, so the tag, making false comments, and severely disturbing the social order. Wenliang was forced to sign a declaration to cease and desist, and in addition, the police informed him that if he would continue to engage in illegal activity, he would be punished. A bit later, he contracted the virus while working at Wuhan Central Hospital and ultimately died of it. His treatment received a lot of attention from the media. There were certain hashtags trending, such as Wuhan government owes Dr. Li Wenliang an apology and we want freedom of speech. Again, those hashtags were censored almost immediately and comments were wiped out. In response to the public attention, the Central Committee of the Communist Party then sent a team of investigators to Wuhan. They looked into this. Essentially, the government wanted to investigate which party was politically responsible for the death, and they somehow wanted to analyze the overall situation, how they had followed up on that sort of whistleblowing. Now the question is this a Chinese thing or is it a global problem? And I believe that certain aspects of it are only possible in certain countries. So for example, censoring it up to that extent is only possible in countries with a very strict leadership, such as Russia, Iran, and China. It would be very difficult to do something like that in continental Europe, for example. Nevertheless, it's not uncommon, also in other countries, to discourage whistleblowing by making whistleblowers face legal consequences. In this context, one may even think about Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, well-known cases that exemplify how frequently whistleblowers ultimately are rather punished than praised for having the courage to inform the public of certain grievances.
That's really interesting, and it's important to kind of stop and think. We've all gone through a terrible shock in our countries and around the world, and it's been like waves, and it's still crossing continents of the planet. And we're seeing, first of all, certainly in the network that I'm attached to, an initial sort of sense that, you know, people weren't at work. Many people weren't at work, and therefore they weren't calling for advice and services. But we were seeing many, many stories in the press, and people were going public without even thinking about it. So this is a case where you were saying an individual, first of all, was really warning colleagues and friends, and then it was sent round. And it kind of links to what Karen was talking about of the first initial reaction is a kind of reputational damage reaction. You know, if this comes out, it shows we're not as in control as we thought we were, and the reaction to silence a whistleblower. Fabian, you talked, maybe we could talk a little bit about how do we empower whistleblowers? We've talked a bit about trying to protect them. And protection is always a strange word. Lawyers use it, and what that means is the law will come in when it's gone wrong. There isn't the whistleblower protection police that goes into the workplace as you're blowing the whistle and protects you. And people, there have been lots of questions about this real disconnect between when we talk about legal protections and when we're actually talking about, well, what happens tomorrow? Once I've raised this, and concerns, even if you raise it anonymously, that people will figure out it's you. And we know that that can be a very difficult position to be in, but also very important in some countries that anonymity is allowed as a first way to get information out without linking it to a personality. Do you have sort of some ideas about empowering whistleblowers and something you wanted to talk about in terms of your work as well?
Well, personally, I've done a lot of research about whistleblowing incentives. The underlying reasoning is that, of course, it's possible to protect whistleblowers up to a certain extent. You can always try to maintain their anonymity, for example. But it's not always possible in practice because, for example, if someone works in a small team of people and only 3 people knew about a certain incident, it's pretty easy to find out who reported it. So in the end, negative consequences can be somehow limited, but not eliminated. And at the same time, I believe that most people tend to maximize their own utility. Why should they blow the whistle if they do not get anything for it? Some of them, like Andrea, may be intrinsically motivated. Most of them are probably not, or at least don't have the courage to speak up. And employees have to face negative consequences. At least they are afraid that they have to face them. And hence they tend to be unlikely to report undesired behavior, as the associated risks outweigh the benefits. And I believe that we could say that whistleblowing incentives may be one potential solution for that. Basically has 3 advantages. First of all, it helps companies and governments to obtain information. Secondly, it also sends a message to other employees. If your peers get paid for reporting, that may work as a control mechanism. And thirdly, it also sends a message from the government's or the employer's side by saying, okay, we do not just say, please report undesired behavior, we have a whistleblowing policy, so on and so forth, but we're actually willing to pay you for that. So if we're willing to spend money on it, that suggests implicitly that we really want to obtain that sort of information from people. And from a theoretical background, to explain it logically, I believe agency theory is very suitable for it. We have information asymmetries. On the one side, we have deferring interests on the other side, and whistleblowing incentives can help to reduce both. They can, on the one side, help to obtain information, look at information as a purchasable good, and on the other side, also align interests, because basically the employer may have an interest in obtaining that information. But why should an employee who is simply maximizing his or her own utility provide that information? And if they get money for it, then okay, yes, they have an incentive to somehow come forward. If they don't get anything for it, they can maximize their own utility by just remaining quiet, and they have deferring interest from the employer who wants to find out about it. So I believe that in many cases, providing people with a reward, which would then also help to somehow compensate for the negative consequences, may be very valuable.
Well, you've hit on one of the most controversial issues in the world of whistleblowing, not because there haven't been incentive programs that are existing, and clearly they are. They tended to focus on sort of the security side of companies, so Security Exchange Commission in the US, and I know from Canada, where I'm originally from, some of the provinces, the Ontario Securities Exchange Commission has also put that in, and I know there are some other programs in Europe as well, tending to focus on the financial industry or have a very much an issue around the profits and securities perspective. And then there's the other one, again, very strong in the US, which is the False Claims Act. One of the ways to distinguish between those two programs is to say one is about really reporting information to an authority, and then the authority does the investigation. So it's like a little bit of a whisper, or as my colleague Tom Devine at the Government Accountability Project calls it, a sort of whisper in the ear, and then you go away and they do all the work. The False Claims Act is different in the sense that it's the whistleblower who was actually sort of standing in for a prosecuting authority, the Attorney General, and if it's taken up by the Justice Department, then that's great, and if they're not, they can still go ahead, and it's very much focused on government, the fraud against the government, but it is more empowering. You know, it's about taking the case and being empowered to take the case, and then you have portions of the fines and the recovery. And in the SEC program, it is again a portion of what it's recovered, but they're usually quite limited in terms of, so yes, they're eye-watering amounts when they work, but very few whistleblowers actually get those because they have to show new information that has to lead to a prosecution, and then they get the money. And those again are very different. And even talking, I think, with one of the early heads of the program of the SEC, he said most people still say they just want to do it, and that yes, it might have got them sort of knowing about the program, but not everybody expects to get the money. So it's a really interesting one. Andrea, do you want to respond at all, or would anyone in the panel? I don't want to put anyone in the hot seat if they don't want to respond, but Andrea, if you would like to respond to Fabian, that would be great. You might need to unmute.
Sorry, okay. Could you repeat the question, please?
Well, Fabian was talking about incentives and talking about a kind of risk-benefit analysis, which is a really interesting one, because I do think humans do something else. And in workplaces, they often do something else that isn't just about incentives and the risk-benefit. They don't do the risk-benefit analysis in quite that way. But do you want to respond on the idea of incentives and rewards?
No, I have nothing to join, to add to what the other panelists said. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, Anna, I'd like to respond if
Go
I
ahead.
may.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so as you said, one of the most controversial points, and I'd be very worried about the concept. Mainly, I must say mainly on internal whistleblowing systems, but I think even for likewise for the external ones. Because as I said earlier, from what I've seen, enabling a healthy whistleblower or speak-up culture is very closely linked to something cultural and moral. And I think it would be true for most countries or societies or groups, whatever, that incentivizing speaking behind someone else, behind their backs, is immoral. And so adding financial reward to that, although obviously you can see the logical upsides to it, would be a huge downside from my perspective. It would just really hinder that cultural shift that we're trying to achieve. So yeah, I'd be very, very worried about that. Seeing at the same time that, as Andrea said earlier, there needs to be some financial support. I absolutely see that, but I don't believe it should be a direct, if you tell us something, you will get paid for it. I think that would be really the wrong direction.
Lee, do you have any comments?
Yes, thanks, Anna. Maybe I could just two anecdotes that I think are interesting to take into account in the context of this discussion about financial incentives. And I think it's also really important to draw the distinction between financial incentives in the form of rewards, for example, like the SEC's whistleblower program, which provides whistleblowers up to 10% of the penalties recovered following the whistleblower report. So there has to be a successful law enforcement outcome, among many other criteria for whistleblowers to receive those rewards. But also compensation for whistleblowers, including interim relief, such as financial support for their leads. And Korea has a really interesting example of both rewards and compensation for whistleblowers. So I invite you to look at that particular example. It's important to make that distinction. But just the two things that I think of when weighing up this important issue of how to incentivize whistleblowers. Firstly, I come back to the issue of harmonization of international standards. You know, we're currently in a situation where a whistleblower can be paid money by authorities from other countries, but indeed prosecuted and sentenced to prison for providing exactly the same information that they provided to foreign authorities. And there's an example of a case, particularly in the financial sector, where a whistleblower was provided an award from a financial reward for disclosing information to foreign tax authorities and sentenced in absentia to 5 years in prison in the country where he was working at the time of coming across that information. And that country has never actually sentenced anyone to a similar prison sentence for financial crimes such as money laundering or corruption. So, you know, I think when you have such vastly different standards applying, talking about financial incentives can indeed put whistleblowers at significant danger going beyond retaliation in their workplace. Interesting anecdote that I think is an interesting example of the financial versus moral incentives is that in the first 6 months of operation of the Dutch House of the Whistleblowers, they received almost as many whistleblower reports as the SEC did in the first 6 months of operation of the Office of the Whistleblower. And the Dutch system doesn't provide for any financial incentives or rewards to whistleblowers. It was just established as a specific whistleblower protection authority. It was well communicated, and the public, I think, responded to that reassurance and the fact that this agency was there to help whistleblowers. So I don't think that you necessarily need a financial incentive to make people come forward. Instead, I think people will come forward if they feel protected and safe to do so. So that's just something to add into those discussions and some interesting evidence from country practices. And maybe just finally, I'll mention an interesting study that was done on hijacking the moral imperative, which I saw some people mentioned in the chat, that the risk of having financial incentives is that reporting persons may wait until the behavior becomes so serious that they're sure that there will be a positive law enforcement outcome and they're sure to have that reward. So it doesn't necessarily have the intended preventive or remedial impact that whistleblower reporting is supposed to have.
Really interesting. Fabian, you've opened the hornet's nest. We've got very, very different responses on the chat, at least people being very interested in exploring it and needing to explore it because it is being explored at the policy level, perhaps in their countries. And it's important to look at. And there doesn't necessarily need to not be to me, the people who put themselves at risk for a company and who do the right thing should be fully protected in so many ways in an earlier stage, and therefore the losses shouldn't be high. But that, certainly in terms of rewarding people, so many people don't even get thanked at all. There are so many ways in which we can make sure they are losing less, and we can't necessarily remove all risks, but whether the reward as a starting point. Do you want to have a comeback on that, Fabian? What do you?
Yes, thank you very much, Anna. I totally agree with Karen. Of course, if you can do it through culture, it's much better. And I'm certainly not suggesting whistleblowing incentive as a one-size-fits-all solution. My impression is that in many cases, it's not possible to do it entirely through culture. That many people still don't want to leave their comfort zone, and they say, okay, if I don't get anything for it, I'm not going to do it. And then whistleblowing incentives may be a potential solution. However, it goes without saying that, of course, they are also associated with many disadvantages. For example, they can cause a lack of trust among employees. So on the one side, you can have an additional control mechanism by paying people for blowing the whistle and thereby making peers supervise each other. At the same time, it leads to loss of trust and people may be less motivated, so on and so forth. So I do see the downsides, and of course it's a very controversial issue, but I agree, if you can do it through culture, it's better. Regarding Leah's point, I would like to follow up on one of the anecdotes. You mentioned that someone disclosed information to foreign tax authorities and got money for that. So there are several cases of that. The most prominent one is probably tied to Germany. However, I'm not sure that can be seen as whistleblowing, because that was a simple trade. People stole information in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, put them on CDs and sold them to the German tax authorities. The incentive did make people come forward. I'm not sure those people would have reported the information if they had not received the money for it. The sums were very significant, in the millions. It was done through the German Secret Service. However, it was a severe violation of Swiss laws, and people were charged with a whole range of crimes, among others spying. And I think here we need to differentiate. Making people come forward is a good thing, but of course in compliance with the law. So if they break laws by coming forward, whistleblowing should not be used as an excuse.
If I can sort of, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I think these have been fascinating conversations. One of the things, the questions that have come up is, what do you do where there's been a history? There's, first of all, this separate question of actually blowing the whistle with official information involved. And for those of you who want to look at potential ways of addressing that, there is something called the Schwane Principles, which was a guide that was done not actually before the Snowden disclosures, although the work had been done a few years before, on the access to information and national security, with some areas in which a number of experts from around the world worked hard to come up with some examples of how to protect those who work in armed forces and national security field, and to provide some safety valves, because just because something is rendered officially secret does not mean that that is a cover for committing criminal acts. So there are so many areas that, yes, can be quite complicated. One of the questions around culture and spying in countries where blowing quote, reporting your neighbors would then get them in trouble in a environment of authoritarian control. And one of the things that we've always said is that you make sure there isn't one channel in which someone is meant to go, and that's the only protected channel. So that has been a huge and ongoing discussion and fight, because really, let's put it on the table that whistleblowing is about accountability. Is it about the accountability of every staff member? I would say No, it is about the accountability of the organization and the employers and how they address these issues. And whistleblowing is one way to ensure that they do, that people in powers of, in positions of decision-making have to account for their conduct and their actions. And if they know that they will never be outwardly held to account, then we have a problem. And that is why whistleblowing is in whistleblower protection laws are able to go to authorities and are able to go publicly. And the issue that I think Lee raised, which I think is really important, is in the public and international sphere. There is now more, I would say almost a return to, but a look at how do you hold corporations and organizations accountable for their duty of care to their staff to make sure that those staff can speak up and that they are held to account for even that. And we are seeing a change at looking actually not at just the protection of the individual and their fight, which becomes individualized very quickly, but the accountability of the organization to make sure staff can speak up and what they do in real terms and have to show that in a court of law. There were so many good comments and there's so much more that we could explore. Fabian, very much thank you for sort of livening up the discussion again, but I do think we need to really look at this from so many different angles, and it really is a social, political, and economic conversation, and one that is not going to wane in terms of importance over the coming months and years. So I very much want to thank Yaka and the Dean and our head of education and the technical staff here at Yaka for inviting us all to have this discussion with you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Fabian. And thank you, Karen.